Let's get started. Story number 1.
I had always been the type of person who preferred solitude. I relished the quiet of being alone at night, the stillness of the world around me. But that all changed after I moved into my new apartment in the small, quiet town of Brooksville. The apartment was an old Victorian-style building, tucked away at the end of a narrow street. It had a certain charm, with its creaky floors and vintage wallpaper that seemed to tell its own story. I thought I could make it my own sanctuary, a place of peace after a tumultuous year of personal struggles. The first few nights in the apartment were uneventful. I settled into a comfortable routine, spending my evenings reading or watching TV. I had no reason to believe that anything was unusual about the place. But as the days passed, I began to notice small things that didn't make sense. One evening, as I sat on the couch reading, I heard a faint noise. It was a soft tapping sound coming from the kitchen. I thought it might be the pipes or the refrigerator, but the sound didn't stop. It grew more distinct, like someone gently knocking on the counter. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the building settling. But it happened again the next night. The tapping, followed by a soft scraping sound like furniture being dragged across the floor. It came from the same direction, the kitchen. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I walked into the kitchen, the air felt unnervingly cold, even though the heat was on and the windows were shut tight. That night, I decided to confront whatever it was. I turned on all the lights and walked into the kitchen, holding my breath. I checked the cabinets, the drawers, and the refrigerator. Nothing was out of place. I even checked behind the curtains and under the table, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. The strange feeling of being watched was gone, but the unease lingered. I tried to convince myself that I was just overthinking things. Buildings make noise, I reasoned. The old structure could easily be the cause of these strange sounds. But the next night, I heard the tapping again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the kitchen. The sound was coming from upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never been upstairs. The previous tenant had left all of their belongings behind, including a set of old, dusty furniture. The upstairs wasn't really usable, so I had avoided it altogether. But now, I couldn't ignore it. The tapping came again, more insistent this time, followed by a dragging noise. I couldn't make sense of it. Who or what could it be? My mind raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, asking if they could come over. They agreed. But when they arrived, the apartment was quiet. The noises had stopped. I felt foolish for even mentioning it, but the eerie sensation of something unseen still lingered. My friends stayed with me for a few hours, and we talked about random things to distract myself from the strange events. After a while, they left, and I was left alone again in the apartment. But as soon as the door closed behind them, I felt the familiar sense of unease return. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes made my heart race. The apartment felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows. I thought about the upstairs room, the part of the apartment I had never explored. What could be up there? I decided that, for my own peace of mind, I needed to investigate. I climbed the stairs slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The air was heavy, thick with dust and neglect. The walls were lined with old wallpaper that had started to peel away. I turned on the light, but it flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The room was empty, save for the dusty furniture left behind by the previous tenant. But as I stood there, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room was an old rocking chair, its paint chipped and faded. It sat there, motionless, but the moment I looked at it, I felt a cold chill run through me. The room seemed colder than the rest of the apartment, despite the warmth from the heater. I couldn't shake the feeling that the chair was watching me, waiting for something. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, but just as I reached for it, I heard it again, the tapping. The noise came from behind me, from the far side of the room. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I was alone. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the light bulb above me. But then, as I stood frozen in the middle of the room, I saw it. The rocking chair, which had been still just moments before, was now gently swaying back and forth. I couldn't believe my eyes. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, as though someone or something was sitting in it, rocking back and forth. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to leave the apartment and never come back, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, unable to look away from the chair. The tapping noise began again, louder this time, as if something was trying to get my attention. And then I saw it. A figure. It was faint, but I could make out the outline of a person sitting in the rocking chair. Their back to me. The figure was tall, with long, dark hair that hung in front of their face. I couldn't see their features, but I could feel their presence. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft, guttural whisper. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted down the stairs, not even bothering to turn off the light. I ran out of the apartment and into the street, gasping for air. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew it was real. I spent the rest of the night at a nearby cafe, unable to return to the apartment. The next day, I called my landlord and told them about the strange occurrences. The landlord was unusually quiet, and after a long pause, they told me that the previous tenant had died in the apartment, an elderly woman who had lived alone for many years. Apparently, she had passed away in the very room I had been standing in, the same room where the rocking chair now sat. I left the apartment shortly after that. I couldn't stay there any longer, knowing what had happened in that room. I never returned to Brooksville, and I never looked back. But every now and then, late at night, when the house is quiet and the lights are dim, I still hear the tapping, the faint sound of something or someone trying to get my attention. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see the shadow of the rocking chair swaying gently in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I had always lived alone. It was something I preferred, really, my own space, no interruptions, no obligations. I moved into my small apartment on the edge of town 2 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was affordable and close to work. The building itself was old, maybe 100 years, but still solid. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Richards, told me the building had a history when I first moved in. She made a passing comment about the apartment being quiet and peaceful, which at the time seemed like a good thing. Little did I know, there were things about the apartment that made the peace feel a little too still. The first few months were uneventful. I worked long hours, only coming home to eat and sleep. The apartment was always quiet, sometimes too quiet. I noticed that at night the silence felt heavier, like something was hanging in the air. But I figured it was just the solitude getting to me. One evening, I stayed home after work, exhausted. The storm outside had made me cancel plans with friends. The wind howled against the windows and the rain beat against the roof. The kind of night that made you want to curl up with a blanket and a book. I was in the living room, reading, when I heard the first sound. A soft, creaking noise. At first, I thought it was the old pipes, the wind pressing against the building, or the usual sounds the house made as it settled. But the sound continued, a steady, rhythmic creaking. It was coming from the hallway. I put my book down and stood up, walking cautiously toward the hallway. The sound stopped the moment I reached the door frame. I paused, feeling a slight shiver run down my spine. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe the wind. But as I returned to my seat, I could feel the air change. It felt colder now. My skin prickled with a quiet unease. I shrugged it off. It's just a draft, I told myself. It happens in old buildings. Later that night, after I had gone to bed, it started again. The creaking. But this time, it wasn't just the floorboards. It was accompanied by a soft whisper, a faint murmur of voices. It was so quiet at first that I thought I might be imagining it, but the whispering became clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely there, coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just the wind again, or maybe even the old radiator making odd noises in the night. But there was something about the whisper that felt wrong. Like a presence, something unfamiliar. I laid still in bed, trying not to breathe too loudly. The voice grew louder, more distinct, but I still couldn't make out the words. The whisper seemed to move, to shift around the walls, as if whatever was there was pacing the hallway. The air felt colder than it had before, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend, asking if they were still awake. I didn't want to seem foolish, but I needed someone to talk to. "Hey, are you awake?" "Something weird is happening in my apartment," I wrote, my hands trembling as I typed. The response came almost immediately. "Probably just the wind. You're fine. Relax." It was comforting to hear my friend's reassuring words, but I wasn't convinced. I couldn't ignore the sensation of being watched or the unease in my chest. The whispering continued, and I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of my bed. I must have eventually fallen asleep because when I woke up, it was morning. The apartment felt normal again, bright and airy, as it always did in daylight. I tried to tell myself that it had all been a product of my imagination, a bad dream, or maybe even some noise from the outside. But I knew deep down that it wasn't normal. Something had been there with me. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I found myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I walked through the hallway, as though expecting to see something or someone lurking there. The whispers didn't stop. At night, they would return, and just faint and soft at first, growing louder until they were impossible to ignore. The sounds weren't just limited to the hallway anymore. They seemed to follow me from room to room. It wasn't long before I started to avoid going into certain parts of the apartment. The kitchen, with its narrow doorframe and dark corners, seemed to radiate a strange energy, like something was watching me from the shadows. The bathroom door would creak open on its own sometimes, and I would feel a cold breath on the back of my neck whenever I walked past it. I decided to reach out to Mrs. Richards, the landlord, to ask if anything strange had happened in the building before. I wasn't sure if she would take me seriously, but at this point, I was desperate for answers. When I spoke to her on the phone, she didn't seem surprised. "Oh, you're noticing it now, are you?" she said. "I figured it would happen sooner or later." I didn't know how to respond. "What do you mean?" "There's something about that apartment," she continued, her voice soft. "Something that's been there a long time. It's not harmful, mind you, but it's there. Some people feel it more than others. The old building does have a way of making its presence known." I felt a chill settle in my chest. I didn't want to believe her. I wanted to think it was just my nerves or some odd coincidence. But I had been hearing the whispers, feeling the coldness, seeing the door to the bathroom creak open on its own. This wasn't normal. That night, I decided to leave the apartment. I couldn't stand the thought of being alone in that place another night. I packed an overnight bag and called my friend to ask if I could crash at their place. They were more than happy to accommodate me, and I spent the night at their apartment hoping the strange events in my place would stop. But they didn't. When I returned to my apartment the following morning, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I opened the door, expecting things to feel different, but they didn't. The air was still, the apartment exactly as I had left it. I started to relax, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The kitchen window was wide open. I was certain I had closed it before I left. The weather had been cold, and I always kept the window shut when I wasn't home. But there it was, wide open, the curtains billowing in the wind. That was when I realized I had made a mistake. I had ignored the signs, convinced myself that it was just my imagination. I had convinced myself that I could handle whatever was in this apartment, but I was wrong. I wasn't alone. I didn't stay much longer after that. I packed up my things, left the apartment behind, and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what it was that haunted that place. I don't know if it was a ghost, a presence, or something else entirely. But I know that I wasn't alone at night, and I never will be again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I never liked being alone at night. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because of what it brought with it. The strange, inexplicable sense that I wasn't really alone. I was staying at my friend Sarah's house for the weekend. She had moved into an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town, a house that, despite its charm, always gave me an uneasy feeling. It had the kind of creaky floors and long, dimly lit hallways that felt as though they were hiding something. But Sarah had always said she felt perfectly at home there, so I pushed my concerns aside when I agreed to stay the night. That evening, after a long day of hanging out and catching up, Sarah had to leave for a late-night work call. I had already planned on staying in the guest room, catching up on some reading before heading to bed, but as the evening grew later, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. I was in the guest room on the second floor, a room with antique furniture and a large window that overlooked the backyard. The wind had started to pick up outside, causing the tree branches to scratch against the window with an eerie sound. The soft glow of the bedside lamp did little to chase away the creeping darkness, and with every gust of wind, the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker. It was when the wind seemed to calm that I first noticed something strange. I was reading a book, the faint light from the lamp casting shadows on the pages, when I heard a soft noise, almost like a whisper coming from the hallway. I immediately froze, listening intently. It wasn't clear enough to make out words, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the house settling, as old houses often do. But the noise continued, faint, like footsteps, light and cautious, moving across the wooden floor of the hallway just outside my door. My heart began to race. I hadn't heard Sarah return, and even though I knew I was alone, I felt the distinct sensation that someone else was in the house with me. The footsteps grew closer, and my breathing grew shallow. They paused just outside the door. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice tight with uncertainty. There was no answer, just the soft creak of the floorboard beneath the invisible weight of whoever or whatever was outside. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked slowly toward the door, my hand gripping the doorknob. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. I opened the door cautiously. The hallway was empty. No one was there. The air felt still and cold, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I shut the door quickly and locked it, even though I knew it wouldn't help if something truly wanted to get in. The house creaked again, louder this time, as if something heavy was shifting upstairs. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat, but I told myself it was just the old house. Old houses had their sounds. But the longer I stood there in the quiet, the more I became aware of the fact that I was not alone. I walked back to the bed, pulling the covers up around me, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But no matter how tightly I wrapped myself in the warmth of the blanket, the chill in the room seemed to grow. The walls felt like they were closing in. I was no longer reading, just staring at the words on the page, my mind too preoccupied with the strange feeling that I was being watched. And then I heard it again. This time, it was a voice, a low, guttural whisper, murmuring from somewhere within the room. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded as if it were right behind me. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat, but once again, the room was empty. I forced myself to get out of bed. The night seemed suffocating, like it was pressing down on me, and I needed to do something, anything, to break the oppressive silence. I grabbed my phone, planning to call Sarah to see if she was on her way home. But before I could dial, the lights flickered once and then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me. My phone screen lit up in the blackness, and I fumbled with the buttons, praying the lights would come back on. But they didn't. The silence that followed felt so complete, it was almost suffocating. My breathing seemed too loud, too quick in the stillness. Then, as if from the very walls, came a sound, something dragging, slow and deliberate, like fingernails scraping along the floorboards. It started at the far end of the room, moving slowly toward me. I was frozen, my body locked in place, unable to move, unable to scream. The sound grew closer, the dragging noise increasing in intensity as it made its way across the room, closer to the bed, closer to where I sat trembling. The air grew colder still, and I could almost hear the sound of ragged breathing behind me. The dragging stopped just at the edge of my bed. And then, in the silence that followed, came a whisper. "Leave." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. My limbs felt heavy, as though they were weighed down by the air itself. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't just a voice. I could feel it, a cold, unseen presence pressing in around me, suffocating me, demanding that I leave, that I run, that I get away from the thing that had attached itself to me in this house. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I scrambled off the bed, knocking over the nightstand in the process. I ran to the door, flung it open, and bolted down the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was outside in the front yard, gasping for air. My skin was clammy, my body shaking, but there was no sound, no presence, no whisper. Just the cold night air. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to process what had just happened. There was no logical explanation for it, nothing that made sense. But deep down, I knew what I had felt. I had felt the cold touch of something not meant for this world, something ancient and unsettling. It wasn't long before Sarah's car pulled up in front of the house. I rushed to her, telling her I couldn't go back inside, that something was wrong. She listened, her face pale, her eyes wide, and then after a long pause, she finally spoke. "You felt it too, didn't you?" I stared at her, confused. "What? The house? It's not just the old wood and the creaking floors. Something else is here, something that has always been here. I've heard it before. Late at night when I'm alone, it whispers. It wants us to leave." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if speaking louder would summon whatever it was. I looked at Sarah, and for the first time, I realized she wasn't just talking about the house. She had known about whatever was in it, whatever had been waiting for me all along. We never went back inside. The next day, I packed up my things and we left. To this day, I have no idea what it was that followed me or what it wanted, but I know it wasn't just a trick of the mind or a house settling. There was something in that house, and whatever it wasn't done with me. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had never been one to believe in ghosts, at least not in any real sense. Sure, I had heard the stories of creaky floorboards and flickering lights, of inexplicable cold spots and strange whispers in the dark, but I always chalked them up to imagination, or perhaps the old house settling. But that night, that long, dark night, changed everything. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just finished a long shift at the restaurant where I worked. I was exhausted, and the last thing I wanted to do was face the silence of my small apartment. But there I was, alone, sitting on the couch in the dim light of the living room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the space. My roommates had all gone out, leaving me to my own devices. The apartment had always been quiet at night, a little too quiet, but I never thought much of it before. There was a strange calm to the place, as if it was waiting for something. But I had gotten used to it. That night, though, there was a sense of something different in the air, something I couldn't quite place. I turned on the TV to drown out the silence, flipping through channels without any real interest. It was just one of those nights when I wanted to turn my brain off and relax. But the longer I sat there, the more unsettled I became. A feeling crept over me, like a chill running down my spine, and I couldn't ignore it. The room felt colder than usual, even though the heat was on, and the shadows seemed deeper, more pronounced. I chalked it up to the tiredness creeping in. Then it started. A faint noise at first, something soft and barely perceptible. I paused, trying to focus on what I was hearing. It was like the sound of footsteps, distant, slow, almost rhythmic. I listened for a moment, but there was nothing. Maybe it was the neighbors upstairs, I thought. They had a dog, and sometimes the dog's paws would click on the floor in a similar way. But then it happened again. A little closer this time, and more deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every corner. The apartment was still, save for the light flickering above me and the growing feeling that something wasn't right. I stood up slowly, walking toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The noise had stopped, but my pulse was racing and my skin prickled with unease. I checked the bathroom, the closet, and each of the bedrooms. No one was there. Everything was still. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling that was creeping in. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something in the pit of my stomach told me I wasn't alone. I decided to go back to the living room. Maybe I was just overtired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I stepped into the room, I froze. The TV was off. It had been on when I left, just a few seconds ago, and now it was completely dark. I hadn't touched the remote. I hadn't even moved. I reached over to turn it back on, my hand trembling slightly, but the remote wasn't on the coffee table where I had left it. It was gone. I searched around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, but there was no sign of the remote. My heartbeat quickened. Something was definitely off. I tried to rationalize it again. Maybe I had knocked it off the table without realizing. But then why hadn't I heard it fall? The temperature in the room had dropped. I could see my breath in the air, the mist swirling in front of me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I needed to calm down. I needed to think clearly. I went back to the hallway and started pacing, trying to calm myself down. I checked the locks on the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. But as I turned back toward the living room, the footsteps started again, only this time they were much closer. Right behind me, my blood ran cold. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, as it had been the entire time. No one, not a single living soul. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just out of view around the corner of the hallway. My breath hitched in my throat, and I froze. I could hear them, closer now, right behind me, but no one was there. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing just beyond the doorway of the living room. It was like it was watching me, waiting. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and I was too terrified to scream. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was drawing closer with every passing second. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure disappeared. The footsteps stopped. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and the stillness settled in once again. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, my body frozen in place. I couldn't even bring myself to check the living room again. All I knew was that whatever had been in the apartment with me, whatever had been walking behind me, was not something I could explain. I waited, minutes feeling like hours, until my roommates returned. I was still sitting in the hallway, my legs tucked underneath me, wide-eyed and trembling. They asked if I was okay, and I nodded, though I didn't feel okay at all. "I think I'm just really tired," I told them. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. I had felt something that wasn't supposed to be there. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, even now. The next morning, I packed up my things and went to work, trying to put the events of the night behind me. But every time I walked into the apartment, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. The silence felt oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far. I found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone just behind me. It was only a few days later, when I spoke to one of my roommates, that I learned I wasn't the only one who had experienced strange things in the apartment. They told me that they had often heard footsteps late at night, soft whispers in the hall, and sometimes they would wake up to find things moved around, like someone had been there. Apparently, I wasn't the first person to feel the presence in that apartment. And for some reason, that made everything worse. I don't know what was in that apartment with me, but I do know this. It wasn't just the wind or an old house settling. It was something else, something that I can't explain. And every time I'm alone at night in the quiet stillness, I feel it again. That presence, that cold, watching something that lingers just out of sight. I don't stay there anymore. I moved out a few weeks later, and I haven't looked back. But I'll never forget that feeling, the feeling of being alone at night, and knowing that sometimes you really aren't. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
I was never one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I considered myself a practical person, grounded in reality. But that changed one night when I found myself alone in my apartment. It started like any other evening. I had just moved into a small one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood. The building was old, with creaky floors and thick walls that kept the noise from the outside world to a minimum. The apartment itself had a charm to it. Wooden beams, large windows that let in soft, natural light, and a cozy, lived-in feel. It felt like a place where I could truly relax and settle in after a long day at work. That night, I had finished my shift at the restaurant and was looking forward to some time to myself. My roommates were all out, and the building was quiet. I poured myself a glass of wine, plopped onto the couch, and started watching a movie on my laptop. The storm outside rumbled, and the wind howled against the windows, but it only made the atmosphere more comfortable. I was used to the sound of wind in the old building. It had become a part of the apartment's character. After a couple of hours, I paused the movie to check my phone. There was a text from one of my roommates asking if I was okay, as the storm had gotten pretty intense. I replied that I was fine and resumed watching the movie. I didn't realize then that this would be the last normal moment I would have that night. The wind outside had started to pick up, and the creaking of the building seemed to become louder. It wasn't unusual. The apartment was old, and the wind often caused the wood to groan and crack. But something felt off this time. As the wind howled outside, I noticed the room seemed colder. I got up to adjust the thermostat, but it was already set to a comfortable temperature. I returned to the couch, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. I brushed it off and tried to focus on the movie again, but then I heard something. A soft, scratching sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was faint at first, like something lightly scraping against the floor. I looked around the room, trying to find the source. I was alone. There was nothing that could have made that noise, but there it was again, scratching, like something dragging itself slowly across the wooden floor. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked cautiously to the hallway. The sound stopped as soon as I reached the threshold. I stood there for a moment, my mind running through every logical explanation. Was it just the house settling? Perhaps a mouse? Or maybe the wind causing something to move? But then, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, closer. It came from my bedroom. I didn't want to investigate. I didn't want to look, but I knew I had to. I turned on the hallway light, my footsteps heavy as I walked toward my bedroom. As I pushed the door open, the cold air hit me in the face. The room was empty, as I had left it, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was nothing to explain the sensation I felt in that room. It was as if someone was there, watching me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. I told myself it was just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The scratching sound had stopped, but the air felt thick, heavy. I walked over to my bed, checking under it and in the closet, but there was nothing there. Still, the unease didn't go away. I went back to the living room, trying to tell myself I was just tired. The storm was making everything feel more intense. The creaking of the building, the sudden cold, the scratching sound, it could all be explained away. It had to be. But then, I heard a sound that froze me in place. A soft thud, like something falling to the floor. I wasn't alone in the apartment anymore. I turned around, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room was empty, but I felt the presence of something watching me. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what was happening, but I couldn't. The thud came again, and this time it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen. The last thing I wanted to do was investigate, but something told me I had no choice. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, which happened to be a bottle of wine, and slowly crept toward the kitchen. The light in the kitchen flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, considering the heating was still on. My breath came out in visible puffs as I stepped inside, but there was nothing. Nothing except the soft, distant sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. The silence was unbearable. The thudding had stopped, but the tension in the air was palpable. I turned back toward the living room, and that's when I saw it. The door to the bathroom, one that I had specifically closed earlier, was now wide open. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't gone anywhere near that door since I had gotten home, and I was certain I had closed it before. I walked toward it, my hand shaking as I reached for the door frame. I peered inside. Nothing. The bathroom was empty, but the air inside was unnervingly cold. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But as I turned around, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darting across the hallway. I froze. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if someone was actually there. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but I forced myself to move. I hurried to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway. I was shaking, my pulse erratic. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe in that apartment. I called my friend, my voice trembling as I explained what had been happening. They didn't believe me at first, brushing it off as stress from the storm. But when I asked if I could stay with them, they reluctantly agreed. I left the apartment that night, never looking back. The next day, I contacted the landlord. I told her about the strange occurrences, about the cold, the sounds, the presence I felt in the apartment. She listened quietly, then finally spoke. "Oh," she said, her voice flat. "You're the one who's experiencing it now. It's been happening to tenants for years. There's something about that apartment, something that doesn't let people stay for long. Some leave before they can even explain why." I never went back to that apartment. I couldn't. I still don't know what happened that night, but the feeling of being watched, of hearing those sounds, still lingers in my mind. I know now that I was never truly alone that night. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had never been a believer in ghosts. Growing up, I always scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as superstition or the result of an overactive imagination. But that night, alone in my apartment, it all changed. It started as an ordinary evening. I had just moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, a cozy little place with old hardwood floors and a charming vintage feel. The rent was cheap and I was excited to have a space of my own. The building was old though, probably as old as the neighborhood itself, and it creaked with every step. I was used to the sounds, the groan of the floorboards, the rattle of the windows in the wind, but that night, something was different. I had just returned from a long day at work. It was a Tuesday, and I was looking forward to some quiet time. My roommates had already moved out, leaving me alone for the first time in months. The apartment was silent when I entered, the only sound coming from the hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of traffic from the street below. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and kicked off my shoes, deciding to make a cup of tea and unwind. As the kettle boiled, I wandered around the apartment, stretching my tired limbs and surveying the room. The living room was cozy, the couch inviting. The bedroom, however, was much colder. The window was slightly open, letting in the cool evening breeze, and the shadows cast by the trees outside danced on the walls. I didn't think much of it at the time, but something about the room felt off, not in a way I could describe, but it felt empty. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I had just moved in, after all. I was still getting used to the new space. I made my tea and sat down in the living room, curling up on the couch with a book. I had just begun reading when I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable once I focused on it. A knock. It was coming from somewhere inside the apartment. It sounded like it came from the bedroom, light and measured, like someone tapping gently on the door. I furrowed my brow. I was alone. The door to the bedroom was shut, and there was no one else in the apartment. I froze. The sound came again, this time louder. Knock, knock, knock. It echoed through the silence of the room, sharp and deliberate. I set my book down, my heart pounding. The room felt suddenly colder, the air heavier. I stood up slowly, almost afraid to move. There was no logical explanation. The knock couldn't have come from the apartment below. This was not a sound you'd hear from a neighbor. I was sure of it. I cautiously approached the bedroom door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I had half expected the door to be locked, but it wasn't. It opened easily. I peeked inside. The room was dark, the shadows pooling in the corners, the bed undisturbed. There was nothing there. No one. The air in the room was still, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I closed the door quickly, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I told myself it was just the old house settling. Maybe it was the wind causing the walls to creak, the knock a figment of my imagination. I turned back to the living room, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but then the sound came again. This time it was from the hallway. Knock, knock, knock. I whipped my head toward the sound, my body stiffening. I was alone. I knew I was. There was no way someone could have gotten in without me noticing. And yet, the knock came again, sharper this time, as though someone was standing just outside my door. I grabbed my phone off the coffee table and dialed a friend, my hands trembling. I needed someone else to hear what I was hearing, to confirm that I wasn't going crazy. The phone rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Same result. My heart raced as I thought about what to do. The silence that followed felt thick, almost suffocating. I stood up and slowly made my way toward the front door, unsure of what I was hoping to find. I glanced out the peephole, half expecting to see someone on the other side, but there was no one. The hallway outside was empty, as it should be. I stepped back from the door, still unsettled. I locked the door and double-checked the windows. Everything was secure. Still, that feeling lingered. The feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. I went back to the living room, trying to push the fear out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the thought that something was watching me. The temperature in the room had dropped again, and I could see my breath in the air. It was then that I heard it, the whisper. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was soft, distant, but distinct. It came from the bedroom again, the same place where the knock had sounded before. The whisper was followed by a faint, almost inaudible scraping sound, like someone was dragging across the floor. I stood frozen, too terrified to move. The whisper came again, closer now. It was as if it was moving, walking toward me. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't explain what was happening. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moved across the living room, a figure, tall and thin, moving just beyond the edge of my vision. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the same empty space. I grabbed my phone again, dialing my friend one more time. This time, she answered. "Hello? Sarah, something's wrong. I don't know what's going on, but are you okay?" She interrupted, her voice filled with concern. "You sound weird. What's happening?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I hear knocking, whispers. There's something in here with me. I'm scared." "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone still concerned, but also skeptical. "It could be the house settling. Maybe you're just tired." "I'm not imagining this," I snapped, cutting her off. "I swear, something's here, I'm alone," and before I could finish, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, moving closer. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Nothing. The room was empty. "Sarah, please," I whispered, barely able to hold it together. "Please, I need you to come here. I'm not alone." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she spoke. "Okay, I'm on my way. Just stay there. Don't go anywhere." I hung up the phone and backed into a corner of the living room, my eyes darting around the room, expecting something, anything, to appear. The footsteps continued, moving closer, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The room was still. The air was still. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, but it wasn't the same silence. It was different now. It was as though the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When Sarah finally arrived, I didn't need to say anything. She could see the fear in my eyes, the way I was trembling. She sat with me for hours, listening as I explained what had happened, though I could tell she didn't fully understand. But she stayed with me, and that was all that mattered. The next day, I did some research on the building. It wasn't long before I found out that the apartment had a history, one that no one seemed to want to talk about. There had been strange disappearances over the years, unexplained events, and rumors of something dark lurking within the walls. I had moved in, unknowingly, to a place steeped in tragedy. And though I eventually moved out, I still hear the whispers sometimes in the back of my mind when I'm alone at night. I'll hear the knocking, the faint scraping sound, and for a moment I'll feel that same chill creeping up my spine. It's not something I can explain, and I don't know if I ever will, but I'll never forget that feeling of being completely, utterly alone at night, and realizing that sometimes you really aren't. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The first time I truly felt fear in my own home, it was a cold winter evening. I had recently moved into a small cottage in the country, away from the noise and hustle of the city. The kind of house that was old, with creaky wooden floors and an attic that seemed to stretch endlessly above. It had been a dream of mine to live in a place like this, isolated and peaceful. It was a fresh start. I'd been living there for only a couple of weeks when things started to get strange. At first, I dismissed it as just adjusting to the solitude. I had always been an independent person, and being alone in this quiet little cottage didn't seem like much of a big deal. But then, little things started happening that I couldn't ignore. It started with the lights flickering. I thought maybe the wiring in the house was old, so I called an electrician. He came by, checked everything, and assured me there was no issue. The flickering continued. Then, there were the sounds. At night, when I was lying in bed, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. The house only had one floor for living, so I knew there was no one up there. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, the old wood creaking under its own weight. But the sounds were different, almost like someone was walking across the floor. I told myself that I was just hearing things. I had lived in apartments before, and the walls always made strange noises, especially when it got cold. But there were times when the sounds felt too deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth, waiting for me to hear. One night, I was sitting on the couch in the living room, the house completely dark except for the glow of my laptop screen. It was just past midnight, and I was finishing up some work I had put off earlier that day. I wasn't paying attention to the time when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the hallway. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was as though someone was knocking on the door to the room just down the hall. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like lead. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I hesitated, trying to figure out what to do. I had no idea what to think. My first instinct was to check the door, but I was terrified. The house had been locked up tight and I was alone. There was no one else there. Maybe it was an animal outside or the wind or anything but what I was actually fearing. But I couldn't ignore it. The knock had been too real, too clear. I crept toward the hallway, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. The house was silent, except for the distant sound of the wind howling outside. I reached the door to the hall, feeling my hand tremble as I reached for the knob. When I opened it, I immediately noticed that the hallway light, which I had left on earlier, was now off. My heart was racing as I stepped into the darkness, the only sound my own breath. I took a deep breath and called out, "Hello?" No answer. Nothing. Only silence. I checked each of the rooms quickly. Nothing. No one. The house was completely empty. I returned to the living room, calm, still unsure what I had just heard, but the unease settled into the pit of my stomach. I tried to shake it off and return to my work, but the knock had unsettled me. I couldn't focus. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer than they should. Every creak in the house made me jump. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but every time the screen went dark between commercials, I would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye. But when I turned my head, nothing was there. The night dragged on, and I eventually went to bed. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. But I next finally drifted off to sleep, disoriented and tired. I rubbed my eyes and slowly got out of bed, trying to shake off the strange dreams that had kept me up half the night. As I walked through the living room, I noticed something odd. There was a chair in the middle of the room that had not been there when I had gone to bed. It was an old rocking chair that had been in the corner when I moved in. I distinctly remembered putting it there before going to sleep. But now it was positioned in the center of the room, as though someone had moved it. I froze, staring at it for a long moment. My first thought was that I had been sleepwalking, but the idea felt ridiculous. I was wide awake when I went to bed, and I knew I had left that chair where it had been. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had moved it myself and forgotten, maybe I was just tired. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the more the unease crept back in. That night, things escalated. I was sitting in the same spot on the couch, just like the night before, when I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't a knock. It was a voice. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but clear enough that I couldn't ignore it. "Help me." I froze, my blood running cold. I wasn't sure if I had heard it at all. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but there it was again. "Help me." The voice was clearer this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice didn't sound like anyone I knew. It didn't sound like it was coming from outside the house. It felt closer, like it was right next to me. I stood up and began pacing around the room, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. The voice had been real, and it wasn't from any living person. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, my hand shaking as I pressed the call button. I needed someone to talk to make sense of this madness. The phone rang for what felt like forever, but when she finally picked up, I almost cried with relief. "Hey, it's me," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I need to tell you something." I explained everything, the knocks, the whispers, the voice. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she paused before speaking. "You should leave," she said, her voice serious. "I know it sounds crazy, but I've heard things like this before. That house, there's something not right about it." Her words sent a chill through me. I had always thought ghost stories were just that, stories. But now, standing in my cottage, in the quiet of the night, I wasn't so sure anymore. I stayed with my friend that night, and the next morning, I packed my things and left. I never went back to that cottage. It's been years now, and I still don't know what happened there. Was it my imagination? Was it a trick of the mind? Or was there something in that house that was never meant to be disturbed? I'll never know for sure, but I'll never forget the feeling of being alone at night in a place that was supposed to be peaceful, only to realize that sometimes the silence isn't just the absence of sound. Sometimes it's the presence of something else. Story, the end.